Today I'm going to be closing off our series on the battlefield of the mind, and I'm going to start with this question. Have you guys ever been around someone who is drunk? You guys are like, what? Don't look at your neighbor, don't look at your friends and make jokes because you want to maintain your friendships, right? But have you been around someone who was drunk? And I know this is a weird transition from our time of praying for the Spirit to break out to now talking about drunkenness, but I ask because if you've been around someone who has had not a little too much to drink, but a lot to drink, they are not clear in mind, you might have a hard time having a conversation with them. Sometimes for people who are drunk or had too much to drink, they have a hard time walking. And sometimes they're fun to be around and sometimes they're not. I could say maybe in my younger days, I was fun to be around. But when you're around someone who's drank too much, their vision is cloudy, they can't walk straight, their judgment is impaired. And it's only when they sober up or when they're sober, you can have a good conversation with them. And they can accurately reflect and think about their actions. They can look you in the eyes and have a sober, straight, focused conversation with you. And I bring this up because I think in the same light, many of our minds are actually intoxicated. And stick with me, okay? So what I mean by intoxicated is our minds are intoxicated. More specifically, media intoxicates our minds. Social media intoxicate our minds. Entertainment intoxicates our minds. And all too often, we get drunk off of what we see on our social media feeds. We get drunk off of what we see on our screens. And we're left with this idea that what we see is what life is truly about. That life is about what people see, what people praise, what possessions we have, the feeling of being important and significant, to be successful, to be someone spectacular and noteworthy. And the more time that we spend on our screens and we get kind of drunkenness off of what we see in other people's lives or what media and social media is feeding us, it creates an enthusiasm, a hype, and an excitement. And it often leads us to live for the highs of life, which is like our reels, right? We don't make sad reels. We don't make depressed reels, but we usually do reels because we want to show people the happy things in our lives, the highs of our lives. And simply put, we are under the influence of what we allow into our minds. And I think this is why a lot of times at the end of our day, when things get quiet, when we're around for no one else to see, this is why we experience a sort of hangover when we're faced with reality. When we're faced with disappointments and trials and setbacks and things that we just can't really make sense of. And I want to be clear with you guys. I'm not against social media. This is not a message about get off your phones and don't look at social media anymore. This is not a message about trying to make you feel bad about your time on Netflix or entertainment or anything like that. What I'm trying to say is that this is a message about how we are influenced and intoxicated by what we see and give our minds to. And so today, as we end our series on the battlefield of the mind, I wanted to share with you guys a message on being sober-minded. So the title of my message is Sober-Minded. And in contrast to having an intoxicated mind, the Bible calls us to have a sober mind. And today I'm going to be addressing two questions. And the first is, what does it mean to be sober-minded? And two, how do we have a sober mind? And so today I'm going to be reading from 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 to 10 to find out what Scripture teaches us about being sober-minded. So I'm going to start in verse 8. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered for a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. I'm going to start by addressing my first question. What does it mean to be sober-minded? And when we look at this verse, in verse 8, to be sober-minded means to have a mind that is disciplined. And sober can be translated to self-controlled. It is a mind that is not intoxicated or captivated by any type of influence that would lead us away from sound judgment. It is a mind that is alert and focused. And when we look in this passage, these verses that I just read, Peter is addressing two things that intoxicate our minds and the minds of the early church. And the first is this: it's the social environment. The context of this passage in 1 Peter is that he is writing to the church who was experiencing persecution, and they were scattered all throughout Asia. He's speaking to the people who said, I will follow Jesus, but suddenly they're experiencing persecution. They're being taunted, they're being cornered, and they're faced with this temptation to go back to their former ways, to their life without Jesus, to go back to a life that can live as they want to pursue their passions and to live in that lust and to attend parties and get drunk, or to give in and say, I don't want to follow Jesus anymore. I want to live the way I used to. And they were faced with questions about, they were tempted to give up on their lives as Christ followers. And in the same way that the early church was tempted with this social environment, with what the culture was telling them to live and what is valuable to them, we spend much of our time looking at the things that intoxicate our minds on social media, on media and entertainment, and a lot of times we don't know it, right? We don't know that what we're looking at is shaping and forming our minds. We don't realize that as we're looking at, some crazy celebrities, we're like, wow, my life would be so much better if I had just $1 million. Or we see a friend who just got a promotion and you're like, when am I going to get that promotion, right? Or you see celebrities that seem to be living this like high life and you think my life would be so much easier if I just had what they had. And we don't necessarily tell ourselves that, but it's oftentimes the thoughts that run through our mind and influence the decisions we make. And we seek after relationships that can provide us instant gratification. We try to run ourselves into the ground and work as hard as we can to get that dream job or that dream salary. And so our minds are filled with so many voices and opinions and perspectives about what should be important in our lives and what our lives are truly about. And so when Peter was saying to have a sober mind, he was saying have a mind that is disciplined and self-controlled, a mind that is not swayed by what you see, by what the voices of this culture and society is telling you, but have a sober mind that is grounded and focused and single-minded. And see, in the midst of their trials and suffering, I'm sure that Peter was speaking to them. He was encouraging them, have a sober mind, be alert, because they were questioning, if I'm following Jesus, why is my life so hard? If I'm following Jesus and he resurrected and he went up to heaven and he says who he says he is, then why am I suffering? Why are we being persecuted? Why are we being arrested and literally being killed off in the early church, right? And although us in this room might not be experiencing the physical persecution that the early church did, I'm sure a lot of us find ourselves thinking similar questions of, if I'm following Jesus, why am I still anxious? If I'm following Jesus, why am I still financially struggling? If I am following Jesus, why are my relationships still falling apart? If I am following Jesus, why is it that the other people in my life who is not a Christian seems to be having a better life than I am? And I think that's a question that none of us would dare say to your home group, right? Or even God. We wouldn't say, it's just better if I just denounce my faith, because we don't let ourselves think that. But in reality, I'm sure we find ourselves asking those questions in the stillness and deepest parts of our hearts. Why is it still hard if I'm following Jesus? In fact, I had a conversation with a friend the other day, a few weeks ago, and she said, I look at my other friends who aren't following Jesus, and they just look happier than I do. They look more fulfilled than I am, because I'm always struggling to do the right things. I'm always struggling to do things in a way that would please God, and it just seems like it's just not enough. And she was sharing honestly these questions with me. And so the early church was faced with similar questions, and in response to the suffering, to the questions of the early church, Peter writes in his letters to them, be alert and have a sober mind, Because, and this is the second part, because your enemy prowls around like a lion. And this is the second thing that intoxicates our minds. It's the enemy. The enemy intoxicates our minds. In verse 8, it says, your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And what Peter is saying is, be alert. Be on the lookout. Be vigilant. Be careful. Have a sober mind that is disciplined and self-controlled, because the enemy wants to destroy you. He is a roaring lion looking to devour you. I heard a quote recently. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince the world that he didn't exist. I think growing up, when I've heard this verse, the devil is a roaring lion. He prowls around looking for someone to devour. It's been hard for me to imagine that the devil is literally a lion. That he's literally a lion roaring and looking for someone to devour, which is me. I've been to the zoo several times because I'm a mama. I love being a mama. I love the zoo too. My husband doesn't, but I do. But when we go see the lions, it's supposed to be this like majestic experience, right? Because it's like Mufasa, like the lion, right? The big mane. But actually, when you go see lions in the zoo, it's really sad, right? Because this ferocious animal that's supposed to be wild, that's supposed to be running and eating things and being crazy, is caged up in this display. And there's been a few times where we've been close enough to actually see the lion just on the other side of the glass, sleeping. And the paws are literally huge, and it's just breathing in and breathing out. And it's so big, right? But there's a difference between a lion that is caged and a lion that is free to roam, roar, and devour things, right? I'm not afraid of a lion that's caged up, that's in the zoo, but if that glass window was to break and it came out, I would be freaking scared of my life. And I think for a lot of us, we can't imagine that the devil is this lion that wants to literally devour and destroy us, because we can't always see him. But the Bible makes it clear that we are faced with spiritual warfare. When it comes to spiritual warfare, people often over-spiritualize things. Do you have friends like that, where they're like, oh, spiritual warfare, right? Like they made a mistake. They said something offensive, and they're like, oh, it's spiritual warfare, right? This person's mad at me. And you're like, girl, you the problem, right? Or, it's you. Or there are people who under-spiritualize things. And this has been me for the past few years, if I'm to be honest. As I've been going through my own sense of spiritual fatigue, as I've been trying to heal and come back to a place where I can pour myself out in God's presence the way I used to. And what I mean by that is to pray with conviction, to sing with conviction, and God's bringing me back there. But these past few years, there's been times where I'm like, I don't know if this is spiritual warfare. I think I'm just a sucky person. I don't know if this is spiritual warfare. I think I'm just negative. This is just how I think. And you might not believe it, but a lot of things in our lives, our conversations, but also I'm going to bring it back to the things we see. Netflix is spiritual warfare. Instagram is spiritual warfare. The things that we see on TikTok is spiritual warfare. And I'm not saying that these things are literally demonic and bad and we should delete all these apps on our phone. But what I'm saying is the enemy uses these things to get into our minds and intoxicate and influence our minds without us even knowing. When I was on maternity leave, when I had my third baby, she almost took me out. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't walk straight. I was just so exhausted all the time. And I didn't even have the strength to be on my phone a lot because I was just so exhausted. I was off social media. And so I was actually a lot happier. I wasn't looking at, other people's lives and thinking, gosh, I wish I had no kids, or gosh, I wish all of these things, right? I was off social media. I was perfectly fine. But as I got off maternity leave and I was getting ready to come back to church, get ready to start leading things again, getting ready to preach again, I remember when I started going back on Instagram, I started thinking, oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? I feel so I can't preach a message like that. Oh my gosh, this mom is feeding her kids organic food, healthy food, and having a baby on stage while praying. And I was like, that was the image that I had in my mind. I thought I had to come back and be this person that has it all together, this mom that has it all together. And that's some of us, right? You're perfectly fine. You're having a great day. In fact, you're praising the Lord. You're like, God, life is good. And then you go on social media and you see that maybe your friend that you haven't talked to in a long time got engaged. And you're like, she got engaged? And you're like, he got engaged? And you think, why am I single? Is there something wrong with me? Why am I always going to be single? No one wants to marry me. This is why he broke up with me last week. Am I getting too real here? This is why no one wants to talk to me on Hinge. This is why people are ghosting me, right? And our minds think crazy things. And before you know it, I know it's funny, but before you know it, you land into a place where you're like, no one wants to marry me. I'm unvaluable. I'm going to be single for the rest of my life. I'm never going to have kids. I'm never going to have the family or the marriage or the kids that I've always dreamed about. And we start questioning our worth and our identity. Let me give you another realistic example. You see, you're perfectly fine again. You're perfectly fine having a great day. And then you go on social media. You go on your stories and you see that all of your close friends hung out, but you're not there. And instead of thinking, oh, maybe this was unplanned and spontaneous, you think, why didn't they call me? Why didn't they invite me? If they cared about me, if I was a priority, then they would have at least texted and asked if I'm available. And when we start spiraling and thinking these thoughts, before you know it, you think, my community doesn't care about me. They're just like the community that I had to leave a few years ago. I'm not a priority. If they really cared about me, then they would have hit me up. And again, our worth, our value is being put into question. As I was struggling to come back to church, as a leader, I had a spiritual direction meeting with my spiritual director. And I told her, Patty, I'm just really anxious and I'm struggling. I know it's social media, I know it's my childhood wounds. I feel this need to perform. And I was saying, I know I've done all this work, therapy, I've thought about all these things and I just can't stop wanting to perform. I can't stop thinking about what other people think about me. And she's the sweetest grandma. She's literally 70 and she's the sweetest grandma. And in her sweetest voice, she looked at me and she said, Andrea, I'm going to say something to you that I don't think a lot of younger people like to hear nowadays. And I was like, oh no, she's going to rebuke me, right? She's going to tell me, get over it. But she looked at me and she was like, do you think it could be spiritual warfare? Do you think it could be that because you have chosen to step out in faith and chosen to walk in obedience and chosen to say yes to the things that God has entrusted to you, that maybe there's spiritual warfare going on in your life? And I want to say the same question to you guys. Do you think that maybe some of the thoughts you have, some of the things that even happen in your life could be spiritual warfare? That it could be because the enemy wants to destroy you and to distract you? Let me tell you this, you can always discern when it's a spiritual battle when your identity is being attacked. Donald mentioned a few weeks ago that when Jesus was led into the desert to be tempted, Satan over and over again said to him, if you are the Son of God, then do this. And I think in many ways, the devil attacks our identities, our worth, by looking at us and saying, if you are a child of God, then why are you anxious? If you are a child of God, why do you still care about what people think? If you are a child of God, then why does your life seem to be in shambles, but the people around you that don't follow Jesus seem to have a better life than you? He is the accuser. He is the liar. He is the one that attacks our worth and our identity, and that's the first thing that he's going to attack. And this is so contrary. We know, we can discern what is from God and what is not from God, because it is so contrary to what God speaks over our lives. God is the only one that can give us our identity. God is the only one who can give us our inherent worth. God is the only one who can give us that divine purpose, that sense of satisfaction in this life that we all look after. And so this is what it means to be sober-minded. It's to be alert and attentive because the enemy prowls around like a lion to destroy us. And it's interesting that Peter says, have a sober mind, right? He says, have a sober mind because our battle against the enemy always begins in the mind. It begins with the lies here. It begins with the thoughts here, the negative thoughts that we have, the conclusions that we come to that affect our actions and our decisions. Spiritual warfare always begins in the mind. I recently heard a quote that said, the greatest battle of our generation is being fought between our ears. The greatest battle of our generation is being fought in our minds. We have more access to knowledge and information than we ever have before. We have more access to sermons and mental health resources than ever before, but why are we still anxious? Why are we still depressed? Why are we still struggling with the voices of comparison? And this brings me to my second point. My second question, how do we have a sober mind? Having a sober mind not only means being alert and having sound judgment, but it actually means to have the mind of Christ. In 1 Corinthians 2:15-16, it says that the person without the Spirit does not accept the things of the Spirit, for they are foolishness to him. But we, as followers of Jesus, we, as people who are born again, have the mind of Christ. And to have the mind of, so the question is, how do we have the mind of Christ? How do we have a mind that can discern the things of the Spirit? How can we have a mind that discerns the voice of God above all the other voices in our lives? How do we have a mind like Christ that's sound, that's single-minded, that's focused? To have a mind of Christ means to live for an audience of one. To live for an audience of one. In John chapter 5, verse 19, it says, Jesus gave them this answer, very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son does also. Jesus lived for the audience of one. In our society, in our time with technology, we have an endless amount of voices and perspective and outlets and opinions telling us how we're supposed to live, how we should prioritize our time, how we should make decisions, what things we should value and give ourselves to. And the voices are endless. The voices are endless. And when we listen to too many voices and too many outlets and too many opinions and too many perspectives, it's impossible to have a sober mind, a mind that can think clearly, a mind that can think with clarity and think with single-mindedness. And so the only way to have a sober mind is to listen to the voice and opinion and the perspective of the one who matters the most. And see, what we have to do is we have to somehow make it a priority in our days, in our lives, in a practical way, whether that means in the morning you choose not to look at your phone for a few hours. You choose not to look at your phone until noon, or you choose not to look at entertainment or media at certain times, but it's making space to actually make God's voice the most important voice in our lives. To weigh our decisions and the things that we say according to how we think God sees things. It's to have a perspective that is so consumed with pleasing the one opinion that actually matters, the one perspective that actually matters. And that's what Jesus did. And it's only when we live for the audience and approval of one person that God can begin to work in our minds and give us the clarity and the sobriety that we so eagerly desire. The second way to have the mind of Christ is to have an eternal perspective. I know this sounds kind of like, well, I've heard that before. Yeah, we're going to go to heaven one day, right? But this actually is the compass for all of us that we should live by. Jesus did everything for his Father with his eyes set on eternity. And in the same way, in verse 10, Peter encourages us when he says, "And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast." And what Peter is saying, be sober-minded. Be alert. Be alert of how the enemy wants to destroy you, because in just a little while, Jesus is going to come back and he's going to restore you and make you firm and steadfast. He's saying, set your eyes on the things above. And did you know that in the Bible, in the New Testament, there's 6 instances where the New Testament authors tell us to have a sober mind. And in all 6 instances, it is always attached to the mention of our coming salvation. What is to come? The work that he started in us but will be brought to completion on the day of Jesus' return. And the metaphor that I would like to use is a telescope versus a microscope. A microscope allows us to see the small details up close, but a telescope enables us to see far off objects. It allows us to see the bigger picture. And in the same way, having an eternal perspective allows us to get our minds off of the everyday things that hinder us and weigh us down. And it allows us to kind of take a step back and see the bigger picture of where we're called to, of the person that's actually in control of our lives. Our perspective of eternity impacts our everyday lives because it shapes what we are motivated by. It shapes how we view our relationships. It shapes how we define success. Our culture might tell us that success is about how much money you make and the Tesla you have. No offense to anyone who has a Tesla. But, we want to define success in the things we have. But the Bible, when we have an eternal perspective, the Bible makes it clear that success is actually about obedience. And so when we have an eternal perspective, it is the way in which we can make sense of the things in our lives every day, the way in which we can make decisions that actually have eternal significance. Now, I'm going to close with this. I promise. You guys are like, people always say that, but I'm going to close with this. A few years ago, before a year after my husband and I got married, after William and I got married, my grandma passed away. And to be honest, I saw my grandma pretty often, but because of our language barrier and time, I really couldn't speak to her as much. Looking back, I wish I had asked her more about, her experiences in the Korean War and more about her experiences of escaping to America and her experiences of, leading our family during a time where they had nothing. But she passed away before I could really sit and have that, those conversations with her. And when she passed away, I remember that we had the showing, the viewing where they have the body in the casket. And just to give you guys a little background about my grandma, by God's grace, she got saved later in her years. It's a miracle story. She got saved. She wasn't seeking after God, but God just found her. And what happened was she started doing a lot of work in a nation where Christians are persecuted. And she built orphanages, she built hospitals, and her way of serving those people was to invest and to give away all the things that she had. And so by the time she passed away, she had built a couple orphanages, a couple hospitals and schools. And as a young child, I would always see pictures of her holding all these orphans. I would see pictures of her, ribbon cutting in front of a building, a hospital building that she helped make. And I remember at her viewing with her body there in the casket in the front, her body was there. I remember I was sitting down in the pews looking up at the screen. And sometimes they have a video or a slideshow of their lives to kind of commemorate and remember their lives. And I was sitting there looking at my grandma's pictures, and I was so moved because I had so many questions I wish I could have asked her. Like, how did you end up, doing this? How did you end up doing the ministry that you did? And in the slideshow, there was all these pictures of her holding orphans. There was pictures of her with us, her grandchildren. There was pictures of her with our family, celebrating our birthdays. And there was just so many pictures commemorating her life. And as I was sitting there looking, I remember thinking, yeah, I wish I could have asked questions. I wish I could have asked her more about, what she did. And I think that's the crazy thing about funerals, right? That's the crazy things when we're faced with death, face to face, at the end of someone's life. The things that show up on that screen, it's not the degree that they had. It's not, the accomplishments they had. It's not the nice house they owned, but it's about the people that they've impacted, the memories that they've made with people that they've impacted. And I remember the slideshow came to a close, and I went up. I went up and walked, and I saw my grandma. And I remember that it was just our family, and it was our kind of closing prayers. We were saying goodbye to her before we do the final close of the casket. And my dad, he is one of the people that have influenced me the most spiritually. He led me to Christ. He's a missionary. He's a crazy and wild man who loves the Lord. He looked at me and he's like, touch her. And I was like, touch her body? And he's like, yeah, touch her body. And he's like, touch it. And he's like, just touch it. And I was like, no, I don't want to touch her body. Like, we're not supposed to do that. I was like, Dad, we're not supposed to do that. But he's like, no, touch it. And he grabbed my hand and he put my hand on her face. And it was cold and it was firm and there was no life in it. And he looked at me and he said, it's just a body. And when he said that, I knew what he meant. He was saying, it's just a body. One day we're all going to see our Father face to face. If our true destination is eternity, if our true destination on this earth is about heaven, then we would know that everything right now in this life is temporary, except the people that God uses us to impact, to love, and to serve. And that sobered my mind, you guys. That sobered my mind. It seared in my mind because it gave me the courage to live out my faith with the idea that one day I'm going to see Jesus face to face. That my fears are temporary. That even my struggles, whether it's financial struggles, I have a Father up there right now who knows my needs. It's helped me to have a heavenly perspective. And see, as I was writing this message, and today in the morning, as I was getting ready and just preparing and doing my final run through of my manuscript, I remember as I was praying, the word that came to my mind is restless. I feel like we're restless people. We're restless. We have anxiety. We struggle with depression, but we also struggle with grief. We struggle with trying to make sense of our temporary lives. Why did these things have to happen this way? Why did my mom and dad have to go through this hardship? Or why am I faced with this crisis? And there's two things, right? We're restless because of our emotions, but we're also restless because we're trying to make sense of the things that we're facing on this side of eternity, the painful things that we can't make sense of. And the word that came to my mind was restless. And so for those of you that are struggling with making sense of what you're feeling, the grief, the pain, the anxieties, the depression, the things that take a hold of our mind and intoxicate us, I felt led to just say that he who began a good work in us will bring it to completion. And that's our hope, amen? I'm going to invite us to just close our eyes, and I've asked the worship team to lead us into this song. And as we were singing it earlier, I just felt in my heart I wanted to end our time with this song. So we're going to sing this song, and I'm going to open up the altar for a space if you want to receive prayer. And so yeah, just